Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Thursday, March 26th, where we have returned from spring break. So I hope you had a good spring break. And we are continuing our viewing of horror films where I cheated and am giving you a second horror film from the 1960s. Psycho, as you know, was from the first part of the 1960s, and Dawn of the Dead, or I'm sorry, Night of the Living Dead, is from the second part of the 60s. A decade that was filled with all kinds of conflict and all kinds of flair and a hope of revolution that didn't come to fruition. Director George Romero has basically reinvented the zombie tale in Night of the Living Dead, because prior to this, zombies were basically known as Haitian entities through voodoo and psychological trauma. Basically, were buried alive. They had the appearance of being dead, and then they were dug up. And of course, we think that there was some sort of medication involved, perhaps the poison of a pufferfish. Some researchers at Harvard determined that. If you've ever seen the film Serpent of the Rainbow, it's based on the book that was based on an investigation of the Haitian zombie. And this is an entity that would ultimately be enslaved, and because they wouldn't necessarily have conscious memories, but would still be able to engage in physical activities. And the first zombie film, which I have in the notes below, is a film called White Zombie, where the threat is that now a Caucasian individual will be turned into a zombie in Haiti. And it stars no other than Bela Lugosi. If you remember Bela Lugosi of Dracula fame. But at any rate, George Romero came up with this film and he called his entities ghouls. But it turns out that during one of the early reviews, someone referred to them as zombies. The name is stuck, and basically history was made. This low budget, Romero calls it guerrilla filmmaking, independent film, basically changed the horror genre in part because of a copyright error. That in the final version of the film, somehow the copyright mark had been left off, which meant that the film was in public domain. And the media at the time, being quite limited, mostly television, would show this film constantly during film festivals, Halloween, all of the rest. So in some ways it was terrible for Romero because he never got compensated for the profits of this film. But in some ways it was wonderful because he got incredible distribution of this film, and that basically created the zombie genre, perhaps the most well-known being Dawn of the Dead, which was a sequel that Romero wrote, where he used the zombie very obviously as a metaphor for consumers who could never be satisfied, were forever hungry. But we see that idea as well in Night of the Living Dead. And the 1960s really was a time of great reflection. If you know anything about Rosemary's Baby, another great horror film from the 60s, also based on a novel, much like Psycho, and many of the other films we've seen have been based on novels. The film Rosemary's Baby, if you haven't seen it, I very strongly encourage you to see it because it's wonderful and it very closely follows the film. And one of the elements of the film is the discussion of God being dead, which was actually a real headline that they had filmed from one of the popular magazines of the time. If you don't know the plot of Rosemary's Baby, it's about the birth of the Antichrist. And I'm not going to tell you anymore. I don't want to give any spoilers. So going back to Night of the Living Dead, in 1999, the Library of Congress, remember them, the Film Registry, declared this film as culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. But that's not the way it was viewed when it was initially released. A limited release, it was viewed as a kind of B movie, and oftentimes it was paired with afternoon movies geared towards children. They didn't have the rating system that we have today. It absolutely horrified audiences, especially children. And the theme of cannibalism is only one of the many reasons why children and adults were horrified. It might seem somewhat tame by today's standards, but not upon its initial release. So much so, if you go down to the first section, you'll see that I've got a review by Roger Ebert. Roger Ebert being a very famous film critic, perhaps the most famous film critic. When he initially reviewed Night of the Living Dead, he talked about his experience in the theater and that he viewed the film almost pornographic. And it was only years later that he wrote another review where he talked about that he had misviewed the film. This was after there were lots of other critics from other countries that were lauding this particular film as a wonderful commentary on the social and political times, and also this idea of zombie being a wonderful metaphor for the masses basically being aimless, and also the idea of revolution, which was something that was in the face of everyone in 1960s, and the reality that needed to be faced in this story, which has become a classic trope of all zombie films, that the real monster is not the zombie, the real monster happens to be the survivors. They're the ones who lack humanity. There is a wonderful documentary that I encourage you to see, and you can see this in the first section. It's available for streaming on Amazon, YouTube, DVD at the GCC Library, Interlibrary Loan, or I also have a web link that you can access. And whenever I can find a free link, I will, of course, provide it to you. And that said, actually, this is in the third section, I'm sorry, about the documentary from 2013, A Night of the Living Dead. And it's called The Birth of the Living Dead. It's long, it's an hour and 16 minutes. So I put this as a recommended viewing, not as a required viewing. I really encourage you at least to see part of it, but you will see how this film was made and why this film was made. And there's commentary by the director himself. And George Romero, who basically is the father of the zombie genre. And you can see that I've got a link from GCC's Canopy service where you could stream it, but you have to go through the GCC library. You will get closed captions, however. Or you can just watch it on a free online link that I was able to find. And again, this documentary is available in lots of places like Amazon and YouTube and Interlibrary Loan and so forth and so on. I recommend, though, that you watch the film first. And you can see that in the second section in the notes below, I have given you a link for the film, though of course you can find it in lots of different places. And because the film is indeed public access, you can find it on YouTube, so it's fairly easy to find. I do recommend that you watch a copy of the film with subtitles. That's always best. I was able to provide that to you because it's copyright free, and also high definition. So I think Romero took advantage of his shoestring budget. For instance, he wasn't able to film in color. He didn't have the funding. When he did have the funding, he had already shot a lot of the film in black and white. And I think that's part of the power of the film, is the ability to use the shadows, the light and the dark, to reinforce some of the themes that we're seeing. We saw this in films like Cat People, for instance, and it's part of what's discussed in the documentary. And I wanted to just mention a few things about the film in a very general way. I don't want to give away spoilers, but look for the American flag at the beginning of the film, and you will see that it is basically backwards. And this is definitely a commentary on America gone mad, the world, in effect, gone mad. At the beginning, there's a reference to a time change, and this is definitely metaphorical as well as literal, that times are changing and not for the better. As we find out that we ourselves are the monsters when the masses are uprising, these zombie hordes. And what we see is the collapse of a nuclear family. This is the Cooper family. which is Harry and Helen Cooper and their daughter Karen. We see how young love, which is oftentimes a trope that would save the day, doesn't work in this film, Tom and Judy. And we see how siblings can even turn against one another, albeit because of zombie transformation, which is also a wonderful metaphor for the transmission of disease, something that we will talk about when we get to 28 Days Later, a kind of updated modern zombie tale. But all of these survivors are unable to work together, which is what leads to their demise. And we see how the usual institutions of authority are completely useless: government, law enforcement, media. But perhaps most interesting about this film is our lead, a black actor, at a time when this would be incredibly unusual. That too is discussed in the documentary. And our lead is a hero. And he does a lot of things in the film that would be considered sacrilegious for a black man to do, including hitting white people, and even shooting white people. So there's, if not deliberate, George Romero maintains that he just hired the best actor he could find for the lead role, who happened to be black. And that's where most of the money went, because this was an actor with background in theater. The other actors were basically friends and family of George Romero. It was very shoestring. The props were basically things that were donated. The farmhouse was an abandoned farmhouse that was going to be demolished afterwards, so they could trash the farmhouse they're in. The sense of, I think, of working on the shoestring budget is perhaps illustrated best by where the actors spent their time. They lived in that farmhouse when they weren't shooting, without electricity, without running water. So it truly was guerrilla filmmaking, and an attempt to really create something of artistic merit, which, even though the film wasn't appreciated in that way, I think that upon reflection, certainly the film registry thinks of it in that way. Maybe one of the most famous lines of the film is when the brother is taunting the sister and he says, "They're coming to get you, Barbara." Now we have horror film that is self-referential. In other words, horror film has entered so much into the mainstream that you could actually, or it could actually, make fun of itself. Small spoiler alert, the ending is very dark, and you should watch through the credits. That's all I'm going to say right now about the ending, because I really don't want to spoil it for you if you haven't seen the film. But think about all of the possible commentaries about not only race, but also gender. And what we see is a female character who starts off rather strong and ends up in many ways fulfilling the stereotype of the weak female. So, that said, I hope you enjoy Night of the Living Dead. And at the time, it was quite revolutionary. And that's going to be today's attendance question, because I've got two films from the 60s. So I wanted to pair them. Your attendance question will be due Saturday, the 28th. Of course, if you need additional time, please let me know. As you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. So, which of the two films representing the 1960s, Psycho or Night of the Living Dead, did you find to be more frightening, and why? And obviously, there's not a correct answer to this question. I'm more interested in your thinking. And then next class, we can put some closure onto Night of the Living Dead. And next class gets us into the 1970s. And the film for the 1970s is The Exorcist. And let me tell you, this film brought all kinds of hysteria. And I'm not exaggerating, hysteria when it came out, which we will be talking about next class. This film is the reason for the warning at the beginning of our course outline that this class is graphic in nature. So if you've been wondering that things don't seem terribly graphic, they definitely will be with The Exorcist. Now, I've provided a link with The Exorcist below if it turns out that you want to view it early, just like I've been doing that with all of the upcoming films. It's becoming increasingly difficult for me to find free links, so That said, if you find a better link for free than I've been able to find, please share that with me so that I can share it with the class. Of course, all of these films are available for streaming on various streaming services. They're available on DVD at the GCC library. They're available on interlibrary loan. The links I was able to find sometimes buffer for a long time. Sometimes you've got to click on them for a long time. Sometimes they work on a phone and they won't necessarily work on a computer or vice versa. So I tried my best, and if you find something better, please let me know. And you can see as well that I've included the screenplay, as I always include the screenplays whenever I can find them for the films. Obviously, you're supposed to be watching the films, but reading the screenplay along with watching the films can be very informative if you want to do some detailed analysis. And of course, our final project is coming up. You've been writing journals, you've been writing discussion forum questions, and and you've been answering discussion forum questions. That will continue throughout the semester. But I'm hopeful that at this point, we've seen enough films that you've begun to think a little bit more seriously about your final project. Something that you get to choose, where you get to focus on an element that we've talked about in class, or at least an element of horror film that perhaps we haven't talked about in class. So perhaps you already know which film you would like to address. That's one of the ways you could proceed with this. And if you don't, we obviously have films that are coming up. But the semester goes quickly after the spring break, so do keep that in mind. And in terms of The Exorcist, because it is so graphic, I am assigning you to watch the first half hour, which I have in the notes below under the fourth section, and we'll talk some more about that next class because I have some other materials for you to be watching about The Exorcist. Certainly, you can watch the film in its entirety, and I encourage you to do so if you'd like to. But do note, after the first half hour, it becomes incredibly graphic. So, that said, I think the first half hour will give you a taste of what the film is about. You don't necessarily have to see the film in its entirety, but I wanted to talk about its impact in terms of popular culture. And there really was hysteria associated with that film. So again, our discussion forum response, I'll keep this short so that you can watch Night of the Living Dead and at least part of the documentary, perhaps all of the documentary. I do encourage it. Which film, Psycho or Night of the Living Dead, do you think is more frightening and why? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.